Somewhere inside Google's quantum research labs, a small team of scientists just did something that should genuinely terrify anyone holding Bitcoin, and almost nobody outside a tiny circle of cryptographers noticed it happen. They did not build a machine that can break Bitcoin today. That part is still science fiction, at least for now. What the Y actually did was quietly prove that the wall protecting nearly $2 trillion in digital assets is far thinner than the entire industry. Believed, and they backed it up with math so solid that Google itself just set a hard internal deadline of 2029 to protect its own systems from the exact threat crypto has spent over a decade pretending was decades away. If that sentence did not stop you in your tracks, read it again. Because this is not hype, and it is not some random influencer screaming about the end of crypto for click. This is Google, one of the most cautious, legally careful, and scientifically rigorous companies on the planet, publicly telling the world that the mathematics protecting your Bitcoin wallet just got 20 times weaker than everyone assumed almost overnight. Let's start with the basics, stripped all the way down, because you do not need a physics degree to understand why this matters. Every single Bitcoin wallet in existence is protected by something called elliptic curve cryptography. In simple terms, your wallet has two keys, a public key that the whole world can see every time you send a transaction, and a private key that only you are supposed to know, which proves you actually own the funds. The entire system works because turning a public key into a private key is, for a normal computer, essentially impossible. Not just difficult, impossible in any practical sense, because it would take longer than the current age of the universe for even the most powerful supercomputer on Earth to brute force that math. Quantum computers change that equation completely, at least in theory, because they do not solve problems the same way traditional computers do. Instead of processing information as simple ones and zeros, quantum computers use something called qubits, which can exist in multiple states simultaneously, letting them explore enormous numbers of possibilities at once instead of one at a time. Back in the 1990s, a mathematician named Peter Shor developed an algorithm specifically designed to exploit this quantum advantage against exactly the kind of math that protects Bitcoin. For decades, Shor's algorithm was treated as a fascinating but mostly theoretical threat, because nobody could build a quantum computer anywhere close to powerful enough to actually run it against real-world encryption. That comfortable assumption is exactly what just got shattered. It helps to understand exactly why experts were so comfortable with that assumption for so long in the first place, because the scale of the challenge really was almost unimaginably large. Building a quantum computer is nothing like building a faster version of a normal laptop. Qubits are incredibly fragile, and even the tiniest amount of heat, vibration, or electromagnetic interference from the outside world can cause them to lose their quantum properties almost instantly, a problem researchers call decoherence. To actually run a meaningful calculation, engineers need to link together enormous numbers of physical qubits just to create a smaller number of stable, error-corrected logical qubits capable of doing reliable work. For years, the ratio between physical and logical qubits needed for a task like breaking encryption looks so enormous that even optimistic timelines stretch decades into the future. On March 30th, 2026, a team of researchers from Google Quantum AI, working alongside collaborators from Stanford, UC Berkeley, and even the Ethereum Foundation, published a white paper that sent a quiet shockwave through the cybersecurity world. Their focus was breaking a very specific piece of math called ECDLP256, the 256-bit elliptic curve discrete logarithm problem, which happens to be the exact cryptographic foundation underneath both Bitcoin and Ethereum. The result of their research was staggering. Previous estimates had suggested that cracking this level of encryption would require somewhere around 10 million physical qubits, a number so astronomically large that most experts comfortably assumed it would take at least another decade, maybe two, before anyone got remotely close. Google's new research slashed that number by a factor of 20. Their findings showed the same attack could theoretically be carried out using fewer than 500,000 physical qubits, built around roughly 1,200 logical qubits doing the actual computational heavy lifting. Let that number sink in for a moment. 20 times fewer qubits needed is not a minor technical footnote. It is the difference between a threat that felt safely distant and one that suddenly looks like it could arrive within a normal human timeline, inside the working lifetime of people watching this video right now. To be crystal clear, and this part matters enormously, no quantum computer capable of actually running this attack exists today. Google's own most advanced quantum chip, known as Willow, currently sits at roughly 105 qubits, a tiny fraction of what would be needed. This is not Google announcing they have already broken Bitcoin. It is Google announcing that the mountain everyone thought was 10 years away just got dramatically smaller and closer, and that the honest, responsible thing to do is start preparing immediately instead of waiting until the danger is undeniable. And here is where the story gets even more serious, because Google did not stop at publishing a scary number and walking away. This dramatic reduction did not happen in isolation either, and understanding what actually drove it makes the whole picture even more convincing. Around the same period, Google's own AI system called AlphaQubit made a significant breakthrough in quantum error correction, essentially getting dramatically better at detecting and fixing the tiny mistakes that constantly play. GUA, quantum calculations. Separately, researchers at Caltech, working alongside a company called Oratomic, demonstrated an entirely new error correction approach using neutral atom qubits that could make Shor's algorithm practical with as few as 10,000 reconfigurable qubits, a range current laboratory hardware is genuinely beginning to approach for the first time in history. When two completely independent breakthroughs in error correction land within weeks of each other, both pointing in the exact same direction, that is not random noise. That is a field of research accelerating in a way that finally caught up with and arguably surpassed everyone's most optimistic previous predictions. Just one day before releasing that white paper, on March 29th, Google announced a formal company-wide deadline for migrating its entire infrastructure to post-quantum cryptography by 2029. This announcement came directly from Google's Vice President of Security, engineering alongside a senior cryptography engineer, and the language they used was strikingly blunt for a corporate blog post. They stated plainly that quantum computers will pose a significant threat to current cryptographic standards, specifically targeting encryption and digital signatures, the exact technology protecting essentially the entire internet, including every Bitcoin transaction ever made. Think about what it actually means when a company of Google's size, with some of the smartest security engineers on the planet working full-time on exactly this problem, sets a hard internal deadline just 3 years out. Companies like Google do not attach specific calendar years to multi-billion-dollar infrastructure migrations because of vague, distant theoretical risk. They do it because their own internal risk modeling told them the threat is real, it is accelerating, and waiting any longer becomes genuinely dangerous. As Google put it directly in their own words, the quantum frontier, quote, may be closer than they appear. Google is not alone in reaching this exact conclusion either, and that pattern is honestly one of the most convincing parts of this entire story. IBM has its own quantum roadmap targeting fault-tolerant, large-scale quantum systems by that same year, 2029. Cloudflare, the company sitting quietly in front of an enormous percentage of global internet traffic, has independently targeted 2029 as well for full quantum security migration. When multiple massive, fiercely competitive companies with completely different business models all converge independently on the exact same deadline, that is not a coincidence you can casually dismiss. That is multiple, separate teams of world-class experts working with access to the most advanced research in the field, all arriving at the same uncomfortable conclusion at roughly the same time. Now here is where things get genuinely uncomfortable if you personally hold Bitcoin, because the way Bitcoin's cryptography actually works in the real world creates a specific, measurable vulnerability that most casual holders have never even heard of. When you send Bitcoin from a wallet, your public key becomes visible on the blockchain for absolutely everyone to see, as long as the public key has never been exposed, meaning the wallet has never sent a transaction. Your funds sit behind a slightly different, somewhat more protected layer. But the moment you send even a single transaction from an address, your public key becomes permanently visible on the public ledger forever, creating exactly the kind of exposed target a future quantum computer would need to attack. According to recent analysis, roughly 32% of all Bitcoin currently in circulation, worth an almost unbelievable amount of money, sits in addresses that have already exposed their public key through a previous transaction. That is not a small, obscure corner of the Bitcoin ecosystem. That is nearly a third of the entire Bitcoin supply sitting in what security researchers now openly refer to as at-risk, exposed addresses, essentially just waiting for the day quantum hardware finally catches up to the math. Let that number breathe for a second. We're not talking about some tiny sliver of forgotten wallets. We're talking about a meaningful chunk of the entire multi-trillion-dollar cryptocurrency market sitting behind a lock that Google's own researchers just proved is 20 times weaker than everyone assumed, with no coordinated plan in place to fix it before the danger becomes real. This is exactly why researchers describe the danger in two completely different flavors. And understanding both is critical to understanding why 2029 keeps coming up again and again. The first danger is what security experts call harvest now, decrypt it later. This is not speculation. It is already happening right now, today, while you watch this video. Intelligence agencies and sophisticated attackers around the world have been quietly collecting and storing massive amounts of encrypted data for years, not because they can read it today, but because they are betting they will be able to decrypt it the moment a sufficiently powerful quantum computer finally exists. For most encrypted communications, This is a slow-burning, patient threat. For exposed Bitcoin public keys sitting permanently recorded on a public blockchain, it is arguably even worse, because the target data is not hidden behind a firewall somewhere. It is published openly, forever, for anyone in the world to save and simply wait on. Think about how genuinely different this makes Bitcoin compared to almost any other target a patient, well-resourced attacker might be interested in. A hacker trying to harvest now and decrypt later on a private corporate network still has to actually breach that network first, stealing encrypted files before they can even begin their long, patient wait. With Bitcoin, none of that initial breach is even necessary. Every exposed public key sitting on the blockchain is already sitting in plain view, permanently archived across thousands of copies of the blockchain running all over the world, completely immune to being deleted or hidden after the fact. A sophisticated patient actor does not need to hack anything today. They simply need to save a list of exposed addresses and wait quietly for the hardware to eventually catch up. And given how much money is potentially sitting behind those addresses, it would be naive to assume nobody is already doing exactly that right now. The second danger is what researchers now call, only half-jokingly, Q-Day, the theoretical moment a cryptographically relevant quantum computer finally exists and can execute Shor's algorithm against real-world targets in practical time. Google's own researchers estimated that once the necessary hardware exists, breaking a single Bitcoin transaction's protection could theoretically be accomplished in roughly 9 minutes. 9 minutes, not months, not years. 9 minutes once the hardware threshold is finally crossed. One of the researchers involved in Google's paper, quantum computing expert James Sanders, later stated publicly that his confidence in Q-Day arriving by 2032 has, in his own words, shot up significantly, estimating at least a 10% chance a quantum computer successfully recovers a real private key from an exposed public key by that year. A 10% chance sounds low until you remember what is actually at stake. Would you accept a 10% chance of losing everything sitting in your bank account? Most people would not accept that risk for a single dollar, let alone their entire life savings. Yet that is functionally the bet every Bitcoin holder with an exposed public key is currently making, whether they realize it or not, simply by doing nothing. And unlike a bank account, there's no fraud department to call and no insurance policy waiting to make you whole again once a quantum computer finally crosses that threshold. Here's the part of the story that should genuinely worry you more than the scary numbers themselves, and it has nothing to do with quantum physics at all. It has to do with governance, and it is exactly why Bitcoin faces a fundamentally harder path to safety than some of its biggest rivals. Ethereum, the second largest cryptocurrency in the world, has spent roughly 8 years actively preparing for exactly this moment. The Ethereum Foundation runs a dedicated hub, specifically focused on post-quantum security, operates weekly test networks, and has mapped out specific milestones across 4 separate planned upgrades, all targeting full migration by that same critical year, 2029. Ethereum has an identifiable leadership structure and an established process for coordinating major protocol changes across its entire network. Bitcoin has none of that. There's no single person or foundation with the authority to simply push an update to every Bitcoin wallet on Earth. Bitcoin's entire cultural identity is built around decentralization, around the deliberate absence of any central authority capable of making unilateral decisions, and that same philosophical strength becomes a genuine liability the moment the entire network needs to coordinate a massive, urgent cryptographic upgrade against a ticking clock. Bitcoin's last truly major cryptographic upgrade, known as Taproot, took literal years of community discussion, debate, and careful consensus building before it was finally activated. And that was for a change nowhere near as urgent or existentially important as migrating away from cryptography that quantum computers could eventually break wide open. It is worth understanding exactly why Bitcoin's governance process moves so slowly compared to something like Ethereum, because it is not simply a matter of Bitcoin developers being careless or slow-moving people. Bitcoin's core philosophy treats stability and predictability as sacred values above almost everything else, precisely because so much real-world value depends on the network behaving exactly the same way today as it did yesterday. Every proposed change has to survive an intense, often years-long gauntlet of technical review, public debate, and rough consensus among miners, node operators, developers, and exchanges scattered across the entire planet, none of whom answer to any central authority. This process has genuine benefits, since it makes Bitcoin extremely resistant to sudden, poorly considered changes being forced through by any single powerful group. But that same resistance to change, the very thing that makes Bitcoin trustworthy day to day, becomes a serious liability when the entire ecosystem suddenly needs to move fast against an external threat operating on its own independent timeline that does not care about Bitcoin's cultural preference for caution. There has been at least one meaningful step forward. Back in February of this year, a proposal known as BIP 360 was formally merged into Bitcoin's official improvement. Proposal repository, introducing a new quantum-resistant address format sometimes referred to as pay to Merkle root. This represents genuine progress, a real technical pathway toward quantum safety finally existing on paper. But having a proposal merged into a repository and actually getting the entire global Bitcoin ecosystem, every wallet provider, every exchange, every custody service, and millions of individual holders to actually adopt it before the danger becomes real are two completely different challenges. And right now, developers and investors across the Bitcoin community remain genuinely divided over which specific solution to fully commit to and how quickly to push the transition forward. Meanwhile, across the entire blockchain industry more broadly, the numbers paint an uncomfortable picture of just how unprepared everyone still is. The market itself has already started reacting to this exact story, even though the actual hardware threat remains years away, which tells you something important about how seriously informed investors are treating it. In the days following Google's research, becoming widely known, an entire category of so-called quantum-resistant tokens saw significant trading activity, with the whole sector jumping roughly 8% in a single 24-hour period to reach a combined value of several $billion. Watching traders move real money based on a threat that will not physically arrive for years is a genuinely strange thing to witness. Similar, in some ways, to buying storm insurance for a hurricane that meteorologists can already see forming on satellite imagery long before it actually makes landfall. Whether or not any specific quantum-resistant token ends up being the eventual winner in this space, that kind of early market reaction is a meaningful signal that sophisticated capital is already positioning itself for a world where this threat becomes undeniable years before most casual holders even start paying attention. As of recent analysis, not a single one of the top 20 blockchains by market value currently uses fully quantum-resistant signature algorithms in production. Not one. Some smaller, more nimble projects have started moving faster. The Algorand Foundation, for example, published its own dedicated post-quantum roadmap and has already begun rolling out early support for quantum-resistant accounts. But Algorand represents a tiny fraction of the total cryptocurrency market compared to Bitcoin's dominant position, meaning the assets with the absolute largest amount of money at stake are, ironically, among the slowest and least coordinated when it comes to actually preparing for this exact threat. So what did Google actually do with all of this alarming research? And why does the specific way they handled it matter so much for how seriously you should take this entire story? Rather than simply publishing the exact technical blueprint for how to break Bitcoin's encryption, which would have been recklessly dangerous and handed a literal roadmap to criminals and hostile governments, Google's team developed something genuinely clever. They created what is called a zero-knowledge proof, a cryptographic method that allows other researchers to independently verify Google's findings are mathematically accurate, without Google ever having to reveal the actual working details of the attack itself. This was reportedly the very first time a zero-knowledge proof had ever been used specifically to responsibly disclose a novel quantum cryptanalysis result of this kind. Google also did something else worth pausing on, because it tells you how seriously they treated the responsibility that comes with this kind of discovery. Before ever publishing their findings publicly, Google engaged directly with the United States government, sharing their research through secure channels so officials could independently verify the danger without that sensitive information leaking into the wrong hands prematurely. This is not the behavior of a company chasing headlines or trying to manufacture panic for attention. This is the behavior of an organization that discovered something they considered genuinely serious and handled it with the kind of caution normally reserved for actual national security concerns. Following the initial research, Google went a step further and began actively collaborating directly with major players across the crypto industry, including working relationships with both the Ethereum Foundation and the cryptocurrency exchange Coinbase, specifically aimed at helping the broader digital asset ecosystem prepare quantum-safe security standards before that 2029 window closes. When a company like Google voluntarily spends its own time and resources helping competitors in entirely separate industries prepare for a threat, that is an extremely strong signal about how real they believe the danger actually is. Now, let's talk about what all of this actually means for you personally, because at the end of the day, that is the part that matters most. If you are holding Bitcoin right now, the single most important practical thing to understand is the difference between an exposed and an unexposed public key. If your Bitcoin sits in an address you have already sent a transaction from at any point, your public key is already permanently visible on the blockchain, sitting there as a potential future target the moment quantum hardware finally catches up. Moving those funds to a brand new, never-before-used address does not magically make your coins quantum-proof because the underlying cryptography itself has not changed. but it does remove that specific public key from the pool of currently exposed, already visible targets, effectively resetting the clock and buying yourself meaningful additional time while the broader industry works toward genuine, permanent solutions. Every single time you send cryptocurrency from an address, you expose that specific public key all over again. So the safest long-term habit, at least until the industry fully migrates to quantum-resistant standards, involves avoiding unnecessary address reuse wherever realistically possible. This single habit costs you nothing, takes only a few extra minutes of thoughtful wallet management, and genuinely reduces your personal exposure to exactly the kind of harvest now decrypt later threat researchers keep warning about. Beyond simply managing your own addresses carefully, the other critical thing you can do right now is pay close attention to how your wallet provider, your exchange, and any custody service holding your funds are actually responding to this entire situation. Are they publicly discussing quantum resistance? Do they have any published roadmap or timeline? Companies and platforms that take this threat seriously enough to already be planning migrations are worth paying attention to. And early adopters across the industry will likely have a meaningful security edge over platforms that continue treating this as someone else's problem to solve later. There are a few other practical habits worth adopting today, long before any of this becomes an emergency, precisely because good security habits are always cheaper and easier to build calmly in advance than to scramble for during an actual crisis. If you use hardware wallets, keep a close eye on firmware update announcements from the manufacturer, since serious hardware wallet companies are exactly the kind of organizations likely to move early on, supporting quantum-resistant signature schemes once they become widely available. If you hold significant amounts of cryptocurrency through an exchange rather than a personal wallet, it is worth directly asking that exchange, through a support ticket or public forum, what their specific plan is for handling a transition to post-quantum signatures, because a company's willingness to answer that question clearly and specifically tells you a great deal about how seriously they are actually taking this issue behind the scenes. Silence or vague reassurances in response to a direct question like that should be treated as a meaningful yellow flag, not dismissed as an overly technical concern that does not apply to everyday users. It is also worth resisting the urge to treat this entire situation as an all-or-nothing panic decision, because the reality sits somewhere in a much more nuanced middle ground. Selling all of your Bitcoin today because of a threat that realistically remains years away, based on hardware that does not yet exist, would be an overreaction driven by fear rather than careful analysis. But treating this as something you can safely ignore entirely until some dramatic headline forces your hand would be an equally serious mistake, given how clearly multiple independent, highly credible organizations have converged on the same general timeline. The smartest response sits in the middle, staying genuinely informed, adopting the low-cost protective habits available to you today, and paying close attention to how quickly the broader industry actually moves toward real solutions over the next few years. It is worth stepping back for a moment to appreciate just how strange and genuinely unprecedented this entire situation actually is. We are watching the same company simultaneously building some of the most advanced quantum computing hardware on Earth, hardware that could theoretically one day threaten cryptocurrency security, while also setting an aggressive internal deadline to protect itself from that exact same technology. That is not some strange contradiction or corporate hypocrisy. It is simply what genuine expertise looks like when it collides directly with genuine responsibility. Google understands better than almost anyone else on the planet exactly how fast this technology is actually progressing, and they are not waiting around for certainty before taking serious, expensive, company-wide action to protect themselves. There's a broader lesson buried inside this entire story that extends well beyond Bitcoin specifically, and it is worth sitting with for a moment before we wrap up. Elliptic curve cryptography, the exact same mathematical family threatened by this research, does not just protect cryptocurrency. It protects the padlock icon you see in your browser every single time you visit a secure website. It protects virtual private networks. It protects an enormous share of government and military communication systems around the entire world. The quantum threat researchers are describing here is not really a crypto story wearing a cybersecurity costume. It is fundamentally a cybersecurity story that happens to have one of its most visible, most financially significant early warning signs showing up inside the cryptocurrency world first, precisely because Bitcoin's public blockchain makes exposed public keys so uniquely, permanently visible compared to almost anything else on the internet. That is genuinely worth sitting with for a moment, because it reframes the entire story in a much bigger context than most headlines bother to mention. Your online banking login, the encrypted messaging app on your phone, the secure connection protecting your work email, and the digital signature on sensitive government documents all rely on close cousins of the exact same mathematics Google just proved was 20 times weaker than expected. Bitcoin simply happens to be the loudest, most financially visible canary in this particular coal mine. mostly because its public ledger makes the exposure so easy to measure and quantify in hard dollar terms. The actual underlying threat extends into nearly every corner of modern digital life, whether or not you personally own a single dollar of cryptocurrency. One prominent computer scientist studying this exact field put it about as directly as anyone reasonably could, warning bluntly that if quantum computers do eventually start breaking real-world cryptography within the coming years, nobody should be allowed to claim they were never warned. That warning has now been sitting in plain sight, backed by peer-reviewed research from one of the most credible technology companies on the planet for months already, and the clock Google itself set is already quietly ticking down toward 2029. So here is the honest, balanced truth to close this story out with, because dramatic headlines aside, panic has never once been a useful response to a genuine long-term risk like this one. Nobody, including Google's own researchers, is claiming Bitcoin will definitely be broken by quantum computers on some specific date. What has genuinely changed, and changed dramatically, is our understanding of exactly how close that threshold might realistically be, and just how much less time the industry may actually have to prepare compared to what almost everyone confidently assumed only a year ago. The mathematics protecting nearly $2 trillion in digital assets just got proven to be 20 times weaker than expected. Multiple major technology companies have independently converged on the exact same 2029 deadline, and roughly a third of all Bitcoin in existence currently sits exposed and unprotected against a threat that is advancing significantly faster than almost anyone predicted even 18 months ago. If this story genuinely opened your eyes to something you had never thought about before, do us a solid favor and smash that like button right now, because stories like this one deserve to reach far more people before 2029 quietly arrives, whether the industry is ready or not. And go ahead and hit subscribe too, because we are going to be tracking this exact quantum timeline closely as it continues developing over the coming months and years. Drop a comment letting us know whether you personally plan to move any exposed funds to a fresh address after watching this, because seeing how the community actually responds to numbers like these is honestly one of the most interesting parts of covering a story like this one. At the end of the day, the countdown Google just quietly set in motion is not really about Bitcoin, and it is not really about quantum physics either. It is about whether an industry built on decentralization and radical independence can actually coordinate itself fast enough to survive its own greatest technological blind spot before the theoretical, finally, unavoidably, becomes real. That is the actual question worth losing a little sleep over tonight, far more than any single price chart ever could be.